Okay. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody, to this work session. We will begin, and we have the FPAC mid-year review, correct? All right. Thank you all very much, and the floor is yours. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Good evening. This evening I have Charlie Hookey with me. He's our secretary, has been for a long time. And we just had our retreat on Saturday, so I think most of the other FPAC members are FPAC'd out temporarily. So they're not here tonight, but they're here in spirit, and they'll be watching the video to see what your comments are as we go through. So our agenda tonight. We're going to go over the charge and then some of our processes, how we do our work, and then the activities that we've undertaken relative to our charge for this year, and then do a wrap-up. This slide shows the entire annual charge for this school year. There are 5 components to it, and we'll talk about each one separately. FPAC has monthly meetings, as you're probably well aware. And at those times, we generally have staff come in and talk to us about what's going on in facilities. And we generally have an extra speaker from staff somewhere to talk to us about safety and security, facility maintenance, or whatever the topic of the evening is. And at the beginning of the school year, we take our annual charge and divide into subcommittees. Some members are on multiple subcommittees, some are only on one, depending on their particular interests. And those subcommittees then go and do research, they hold meetings, they draft input for the annual and semi-annual report. We have monthly working sessions as we need them. This year we did something different. We set aside an extra Tuesday night every month for our work groups to meet with staff or with each other to work on their various parts of the charge. So we've had a lot of activity on alternate Tuesdays here. Trying to get facts together for you. This gives us an opportunity to dialogue more informally with staff, and we've invited school board members to join us, so we have times when we can talk a little more informally with them as well. Our annual retreat, as I said, was last Saturday, and you'll hear about some additional things that we've added to the report, sort of based on our discussions on Saturday. The first part of our charge was to develop a long-range vision for the school facilities, and all of our charges, I want to remind you, start out with work with staff to continue our work in these various areas. So we don't do these independently, we do them with staff. So it's not our job to do each one of these things, but it is our job to work with them. And on the long-range vision for school facilities, we all know that the county has changed dramatically over the last several years, and FCPS now needs an appropriate, affordable vision that embraces the realities of a new Fairfax County while maintaining its long-held commitment to successfully address the needs of each student in a long-lasting community environment as close as possible to his or her home. That's about as far as we've gotten at the moment on that charge. We will have in our annual report findings and recommendations. There will be no recommendations tonight, just some observations as to where we are in our research and our studies. The second item on our charge was to identify major maintenance and asset management requirements, again working with staff. This is an area where staff has done a lot of work. They have some good processes in place in facilities maintenance area to identify the assets and the major maintenance requirements. They want to continue and finish that work and fill out the rest of their spreadsheets and databases that have this data in them, but they need more staff and more time and obviously more dollars to do that work. So we would advocate for them to have the resources that they need to be able to identify the asset management requirements for our facilities. In the area of safety and security, we all know there's increased attention in this area, And we know that staff is doing a really good job with the limited amount of resources and funding that they do have specifically allocated for safety and security. But stronger emphasis is needed on the planning and funding of their projects for our buildings and campuses. The next part of our charge says, and I'm going to read you a longer sentence than what is at the top of this chart, work with staff to develop a CIP that reflects the capacity and major maintenance requirements of FCPS and demonstrates the impact of the current funding limitations. So it's a very big, broad charge. Currently, as you know, the CIP is focused on accommodating projected enrollments and program requirements, and it's focused on how the funds that come through the bond process are going to be spent. That does not address all of the capital improvements that need to be made throughout the system, nor does it address capital maintenance that needs to occur. As we've previously discussed with you, the lack of preventive maintenance and scheduled replacement of major capital items results in increased costs of repairing and maintaining this major equipment. The replacement of major capital items should be an integral part of the capital investment program. The $13 to $15 million transfer from the county is extremely inadequate for funding major maintenance. And I'd like to give you an observation that I had from the Joint Infrastructure Finance Committee meetings. During those meetings, there was a lot of discussion about what was needed for capital investment and what was needed for maintenance. And we had a lot of difficulty trying to come to apples comparison with the county. But in that process, they asked the question, how much of the money that comes in from the bonds are you spending for major maintenance? And at that time, there was a line item in the CIP for $12 or $13 million each year to go for major maintenance. So we answered the question with the $13 million number. That's what was in the CIP. That was not the right question to have been asked. The correct question should have been, how much do you need for major maintenance? And that number would have been closer to $125 million, not 13. So as you get involved again with the county in some of these financial discussions, I urge you to be careful about how we respond to those kinds of questions and that we make sure that our needs are identified, not just what have we been able to afford in the past. What the subcommittee is doing in this area is working with staff to try to lay out what are the capital maintenance requirements. There are some things that are part of a school renovation or a school building that lasts for 20 to 25 years, but they do not last for the full 37 years that our current renovation cycle is. So before we come back to renovate that school, some major capital items need to be replaced. Those should be reflected in our capital program. Then there are other things that are not lasting 20 to 25 years, things like carpets, things that last 10, 15 years, some only 5, that are big ticket items that we have nowhere a plan for replacing those and making sure that those things are taken care of when they come up. So our recommendation will be to look at those total costs of how do we maintain our facilities at the level they should be maintained, what will it take? And once the requirements are identified and laid out, then the question can become, how do we afford any of that? Where will the money come from? What are the trade-offs? And there'll be some rather big numbers that come into the fore because we have a very big backlog today of deferred maintenance. And every year it gets worse and it gets to be a bigger and bigger number. So we'll talk about that some more when we come in June with our annual report. We're also working with staff to make sure that all facilities, not just the traditional K-12 schools, are included in our capital program. We have a lot of other buildings that need to be maintained in one form or another, and that all the funding sources for those capital items are also captured and displayed. The last area that we were asked to work with staff on is one that I know you've spent a lot of time on this year, and you're going to spend more time tonight and in the coming months talking about the boundary processes and policies. One of the important things we'd like you to keep in mind is that as we go and talk with the county, it's important to have a credible discussion and be able to show that we are using all the current facilities that we have to the best that we can use them. So we know when we look at the maps, and you'll see some in your later program tonight when we talk about where schools are overcrowded and undercrowded or right next to each other, that those kinds of displays show that we've got opportunities to use some space in schools that we're not using currently rather than building additional space to accommodate overcrowded schools. So we would suggest that those be part of your consideration as you think about what to do for boundary process. Another thing that we feel pretty strongly about is that it would be helpful, we think, to take as much of the politics out of boundary process as we can and have it to be more of the school board leading with, here are the criteria and here are our objectives, and then have a more independent source look at what the options are and either bring you options or bring you answers, so that it's not a school by school, case by case, neighborhood by neighborhood decision that has to be made every time. And we know that these decisions impact individual children and individual families, but we think that the more that we can make it an exercise in what is fitting to the objectives and the criteria, the better it will be for all of the students, as well as help, hopefully, to relieve some of the pressure from you. So going forward, we're going to continue working.
No, it's all right. It's just, it's off center. Is that you or me?
That's okay.
There you go.
Yeah.
Thanks.
We're going to continue to address our annual charge. And for the annual report, we will come back with findings in each of these areas and a set of recommendations for you. Thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or take any comments.
Well, thank you very much. Clearly, you're working hard to address all the questions that we raised for you this year. Thank you. Mr. Moon?
Maybe a question or two regarding a major maintenance or preventive maintenance. Thanks for pointing out what you need versus what you are funding at this point in time. There's a huge difference, right? About 10 folds of what you have is what you need. So with that in mind, would your committee be able to quantify, by quantifying mean actual number of dollars, by only funding $13 million per year as opposed to $125 million, in the long run, how much money we would be actually losing? Is there a way to quantify that? Because without being able to actually show that number, it's going to cost more down the road. So it's better to invest right now another $100 million per year. It may be quite difficult to persuade the people to fund more. Is there whether there's a study done out there somewhere to do that, or whether our staff is able to do it, or whether you guys can do it?
I think we actually asked that question at the retreat. We have some members who have access to industry data about the impact of that in terms of dollars. So I will take that back, and we will do our best and work with staff with what they can come up with.
I would love to get the data, that research, if there's some study done somewhere,
Right.
so that I could take a look. Because on the other hand, we are asking to put in another close to $110 million each year,
Right.
which is a lot of money. When you talk about our annual capital funding itself is already $180 million.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, next I have Ryan.
Thank you. And I have a history question, probably for Jeff. When the IFC was convened, 4 or 5 years ago, was the $125 million figure, or whatever it was at that time, was that what was presented to the Board of Supervisors when they gave us back $13 million?
Yeah, we did cover the total amount. I think it was higher than that at the time, but we did cover the entire amount as we went through items that exceeded their useful life. Yes.
Okay. So at least that's been publicly presented on behalf of this board. My second question is also a financial number, and Karen, I don't know if you'll be able to mention this, but you did refer to the fact that deferred major maintenance continues to accrue. Do we know what the annual accrual of that deferred major maintenance is each year? Is there I assume it's an upward trajectory, right? But do we know how much we're adding on to that each year?
We know how much it was last year, we know how much it was the year before, and we know how much it is this year. And it's increasing at about 30 million a year.
Oh my gosh.
So
Okay.
that we'll be able to lay that out for you as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Karen Corbett-Sanders.
Thank you, and thank you so much for all you do for our students, our schools, and for us. You all are a wealth of knowledge, and are always so dedicated. To the fact that you've added another monthly meeting is just amazing to me. Couple of questions. Major maintenance. There's typically a loading factor when you do an operations plan that has a loading factor for major maintenance of 3 to 4%, which then gets accrued over time and then drawn down. Do you have recommendations on how we would do that here in Fairfax County? And then additionally, you had a question about, or you made a statement about the replacement cost of renewing facilities over time, like flooring, carpets, things like that. If you have a formula for that as well, that would be helpful. And then you have in your report, which was very good, that over 40 years we've doubled the number of students in the system. And if you could give us an assessment of what the impact on facilities, have we doubled the number of facilities? How has our demographic changed in 40 years? Because that will also drive facilities. And then the last is, have you looked at the impact of adding pre-K to all of our facilities and what that would do for our capacity numbers? And I'm doing this quickly because we've got this new 3-minute rule, and so we want to make sure we get our questions in. So thank you all.
We'll do our best. No, I mean, well, we'll do our best to answer your questions. I can't do it tonight, but we took them down.
The loading factor, that 3 to 4% we've heard, and we're at like 0.2% right now. So it's
So that was my understanding, because
Yeah.
when I used to do proposals for building companies, we always had 3 to 4%, and so that's why I was wondering.
Right, so you have a capital plan, and you say, if we're going to invest in this facility, over time, we need this much money to maintain the facility. We invest in the facility, then we invest in another one, then we invest in another one.
and we
that's-
don't keep up with the maintenance budget for those added facilities, let alone for the existing facilities.
All right, thank you. Ms. McLaughlin.
Great. I have a couple questions, and because the clock has started, and you might have heard of our new process of we get 3 minutes at a turn. So I'll ask the questions, and then if you both wouldn't mind answering them to the best you can, that'd be great. But I'm kind of looking at two areas. The first one has to do with where you were talking about the long-range vision for our facilities and the fact that we know we are backlogged so much, especially in our renovation cycle, let alone the deferred maintenance and major maintenance. And what I remember in talking to my planning commissioner out of Braddock District is that even the planning commission was mindful of the fact that when you look at actual square footage of Fairfax County Public School buildings versus the county government buildings, that the proportion of bond dollars then that are given for capital replacement is not comparable. And so then when you add on the usage that occurs in the buildings, which many of our school buildings, as you know, are used by the community well after a normal business day compared to the county buildings. And then when you look at the overall just backlog of our renovation list versus, the cycle in which our buildings are being renovated compared to the cycle for the county, I don't know the answers to those, but I know that what I've heard tend to demonstrate that it's just insufficient right now, the formulation between what bond money is allocated to us versus the bond money that gets allocated to the county. And so I was hoping that you could maybe speak to a little of that, or if it's something that you'll look into more. And then I just have my second question for you with my 1 minute left. And this has to do with the boundary policy and process, and I'm thrilled that you are studying this. When you talked about being able to use a third party who might be able to help bring us criteria and objectives and options that might be devoid of the challenges that politics can bring to it. I was wondering if you could speak to how the superintendent and his administration plays a role in this, because ideally the superintendent and his administration are coming to the board and saying, this is our best thinking based on best practice. And then the board has to make that decision where we weigh in the information that's best practice. And in fact, as leaders, communicate that back out to the very community that we represent. So I'm just wondering how they'll play a role in this, because I do see a value of what you're saying. Bringing in a third party takes a lot of that politics, or the perceived politics, out of it. And but I'm also just mindful that community schools, neighborhood schools, people develop a love and a commitment to those, and that's what makes boundaries hard. And I just finished my 3 minutes.
So I'll let Charlie talk vision first.
On the vision, we certainly, on Saturday, we talked a lot about both of these, that the equity between the county use of county facilities, office buildings, versus use of county facility school buildings, and they're both county facilities, doesn't seem to be on the same schedule. And that's bothersome. We both manage to house the people that we need to house in a comfortable environment and succeed in our assignments, but it doesn't seem like it's completely an equal level playing field. And yes, we would like to look into that as much as we can. But again, it's not so much as being fair as this is what we need. And fair is one thing, but need is a little bit different subject that we want to outline. We have the ability to outline exactly what we need, whether it has anything to do with the county or whether it matches the county or doesn't match the county. We have different needs, and we'd like to fully establish them in the CIP and note them and draw the attention that it needs to get it.
On the boundary side, there was no intent on our part to leave out the superintendent and his wonderful staff. We think they play a key role, and it's just that everybody who works in this building is influenced by people who live in the county. And so our vision would be that an independent third party would work with the staff and the superintendent to formulate reasonable options or solutions for the board.
Ms. Evans?
Thank you very much for this report. I'm always so impressed with the work that your group does, so thank you for joining us again. One of the things that we have started talking about, and the Planning Commission is going to talk about, and the Board of Supervisors will need to tackle as part of One Fairfax, is the increasing issue of socioeconomic resegregation. And this affects boundaries and long-range planning. So I don't see any reference to it in your report this time, but I hope that's a conversation that you have started to have. So that's really my only question, is whether that is something that has come up, and whether you can help us with that very critical issue, which I think is probably going to be one of the major issues that the next board is going to face.
I think it's a big challenge for the county because of the resegregation that's sort of occurring, and then trying to have our schools located near the students. So
Yes,
it presents
exactly.
a bigger challenge for all of us. And I think it's going to tie in with the later conversation that you have tonight on boundaries as well. So I think the major thing there from our perspective is that it's an important criterion for the school board to use as they set out what are the objectives and criteria that they have for the schools when we do have boundary decisions to be made. And we'll work with staff and see what we can do with suggestions for ways to deal with that. But I think all of us in the county have a difficulty with just what's happening sort of naturally.
Right. And that is our challenge. That's our challenge, to work with the Board of Supervisors and the Planning Commission and be thoughtful in a long-range way. Just seemed that this was an opportunity, since you are looking at a long-range vision for you to weigh in on that as well. So thank you.
It is.
Ms. Palchuk?
Thank you. And thank you for all your work on this, as my colleagues have said. I will ask I have three short, brief questions, I think, related to the helpful information you have, and I know more is coming. I think you hit on many of the important topics. I guess the first question would be, as you're reviewing the section on developing a plan to identify major maintenance and asset management, my understanding is that the timeline is currently, and in the equipment, based on 8-hour-a-day usage on average. And my understanding is we're about double that every day, and that perhaps cuts into also useful lifespan due to our schools being used for education, but also for community use, about 17 hours a day. So hopefully you will be able to include that, or recommend how we can further study that, because I think it really does start with, right, information, education, communication, right? Like,
Right.
What is the reality? What are we seeing? So that then we can communicate that. We can clearly communicate that with our partners in the county and the community, and figure out how we address that. I think you very clearly laid out a lot of the points that have become challenges. So having that information, I think, would help. And in addition, you mentioned the staffing requirements. You may or may not know, I've been working with Mr. Plattenberg on possible amendments to our budget, because I heard from our support employees just how much the cuts have hurt the ability to upkeep our schools. And so if you have more information, if you have it earlier rather than later, it would be helpful to know if you have more specific things you, as our independent, in a way, committee have seen, where some of those staffing recommendations would be most useful. And I'm happy to share the amendment I started working on to see if it's aligned with what you've seen so far. And then finally, it's kind of a bigger question, and Mr. Moon and I were sidebarring here, and I know on the schools committee with Ms. Evans and our colleagues in the Planning Commission, we've had started the conversation and with staff about, can we start to really look at a schools and county joint CIP, joint planning, both to be able to better address and plan for proactively rather than reactively development happening, but also to be able to see, our joint facilities, how they're used, what the life cycle is and the renovation cycle as this one Fairfax policy. So I don't know if you've had a chance to or had any thoughts on the feasibility, and work toward having it be more of a joint process with the county. Thank you.
So we agree with you on all of those points. One of the issues around staff is that I know you have a lot of conversations about instructional staff and the people that support the students in the classroom. But without having the proper staff that does the security and safety and facility maintenance, we're also shortchanging our students in that regard. So unfortunately, a lot of the attention is pulled away from those kinds of staffs and put on the classroom when really the indirect effect is there. And on the joint planning with the county, we are all for that. The closer that we can integrate our school planning and our school facilities and maintenance issues and funding issues with the counties, the better off the schools are actually going to be, we think.
I think that also gets back to the socioeconomic changes in the county, that more and more of the population that uses a school building also needs, wants, desires some county services that wasn't always the case 30, 40 years ago. And one-stop shopping would make a lot of sense in a lot of cases.
And then for the use of buildings, that hopefully you can consider that as you're doing the review.
Absolutely.
Okay.
We are so aware of how these facilities are used to the extreme.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. McLaughlin, for Go Back.
Yes, quickly, two things. First, Charlie, I really appreciate something you said in answer to my question, which is, again, communicating what we need. And so I just wanted to kind of reiterate on that point that no question, that's what we've got to communicate. But one of the things that I have found over time is that, especially when it comes to wanting to change the paradigm, especially with the board of supervisors, that being able to get some of that objective data, again, about like our square footage to the county board of supervisors square footage, our wear and tear usage. Ms. Palchuk was very helpful. You mentioned something about 17 hours. I don't think you're going to find the same thing in most of the government buildings. Those are data points that I think are just going to be helpful to us as a board at being able to drive home the point of why the current process and formulation does not work. And because right now with the bond that we get every other year, it's kind of just random, like, okay, 1 year county, 1 year schools. But if it turns out that that's not actually the ratio that it should be based on actual need, then that's a component that I was just saying that I think if we can get some of those additional data points out there, and including then, as I also said, the renovation backlog of our buildings versus theirs, years in the backlog. Those will be things that make it not so much of, well, there's the schools, they always want more than their, fair share, or they only think myopically about themselves and not about the county. But then to what Ms. Palchuk also brought up and Karen, you echoed, and I think many, if not all of us, would be in agreement that having a joint CIP and having a shared ownership of the school buildings in addition to the county buildings would be a win-win, because right now it is very much seen as, here's your portion and you deal with it. But I would say that of the data points I've heard to date, the 50-50 portion on the bonds that get issued every other year is not actually the appropriate ratio. And if it's not, then the sooner we can bring that to the public's awareness and the supervisor's awareness, maybe we can finally get a formulation, and maybe it is just one Fairfax. All of these buildings belong to the county, and we all have a responsibility to making sure that our schools are maintained just as well as our government buildings. So I just wanted to drive home that point.
Ms. Corbett Sanders for Go Back.
Yes, I'll just be brief. I want to clarify for board members as well as anybody who's watching that we develop our portion of the CIP, we adopt it, but our CIP is actually integrated into the county's CIP. And so we want to make sure that people understand that today it is one CIP with 2 sections in it, and that we're working towards doing more collaboratively. I absolutely agree with you, Ms. McLaughlin. We should do more. Ms. Palchuk, we should do more, but we don't want to misrepresent that we don't have one integrated Fairfax County CIP.
Bottom
As
line is
far
we have
as
two
the
separate
bonding
bonds,
authorities-
the bonds are issued 1 year to schools, 1 year to county, so they're not technically one CIP.
Well, actually, they are one. There's one CIP. There are allocations to the different bodies, but as far as the funding authorities go, they look at the one Fairfax and how we distribute between the two. So does that mean we need to reprioritize? Yes, I think we all agree with that. But as it is today, Fairfax County government takes our CIP and incorporates it into theirs. So I just want to make sure that people understand that. And tomorrow we will be having, for the first time, a joint CIP meeting to start talking about those very important discussions to try to create a better understanding about the needs by each of the bodies.
But to be clear, just for the public watching, when they vote on a bond, 1 year they vote on a bond and all of that money is being
That's
targeted for schools, and then the next time around it'll be for county, so you can
That's
have
a resource
one document.
allocation.
Well, but that's where the problem lies, is the resource allocation. Because it's just done as a 50-50 based on our AAA bond rating, but that doesn't do anything to serve the actual renovation needs
No,
in the
I
county.
understand what the issues you're raising. I think we all agree with it. But from a technical perspective, we have, as funding authorities look at Fairfax County, they look at a single CIP that includes both the county government and the school's needs for facilities. And when we go out to bond, we, because of the way that it's currently structured, alternate those. But that's why, starting with things like the schools committee of the planning commission, working together to create a better awareness, a shared understanding of the needs of both bodies is important. And then continuing that with board-to-board conversations, such as beginning tomorrow night. But I didn't want people to think that we actually had 2 separate programs, because at the end of the day, they do come together into a single planning document.
Thank you, Ms. Evans.
I'll just weigh in briefly here about that because I have been working with the schools committee of the planning commission, and one of the things that we realized with the infrastructure finance committee as well, so I also served on that, is that what we don't have is a joint renovation queue, and that's where to my mind the failure lies, because we have not joined the two together to say, as a schools and county buildings, if we looked at them in the same way and looked at which building, regardless of whether it was on the county side or on the school side, needs the next renovation. We don't do that. And so I do think that that's something that we should get to. And I think that ultimately, if we did, the schools would end up having faster renovations.
I could speak to one of our goals is to improve the CIP, what we call the CIP, which turns out to be, as far as the public face goes, just a construction schedule for schools, and does not adequately, or at least at this point, emphasize the need for this major maintenance component of our piece of the CIP, which may join with the county piece of the CIP. And that's what we want to do, is quantify the maintenance aspect that hasn't been, Mr. Plattenberg's office knows what it is. I don't think that it's fully reflected for this document the way it might be. And the other,
So I would just add that as you talk
Right.
with the county about the CIPs and integrating them, that there's also the discussion about major maintenance, because we know they have to be maintaining their facilities as well, and how do they do that? And why can't we do ours the same way or get the same level of attention and funding? and we use ours up a lot faster than they do, as Dally pointed out.
And in a vision of proper maintenance, capital maintenance, in a vision we would get away from these one-shot $80 to $100 million renovations. That's not a completely necessary way to do things if you replace the roof every 25 years, and if you replace the windows every X years, and if you replace the carpet every X years. The building is always better and improved, and it's not necessary to stop and tear everything out and put everything in new. And that's the system we've gotten into, which may or may not be the way to go forward.
Okay, seeing no other my colleagues wishing to speak, I'll take my turn. I know, my 3 minutes. It's interesting, back in 1985, when I started in the County Council of PTAs, I pulled out a speech on major maintenance and preventive maintenance. And myself and Kevin Bell and Phil Nijelski-Eichner did a number of studies, and it was not just major maintenance, but it was preventive maintenance, and we set targets and why it was cost effective. And in the mid-1980s, there was also a sense that at some point the Fairfax County would achieve build-out. There would be no more. And we had not renovated any schools yet. We had only sort of paint and patch, etc. Centerville had just been built, and Chantilly was about to be rebuilt because its walls were separating from its foundation. So this is a reoccurring problem that we have had. I have one question, and actually it's good that we're coming to that. I was going to say, one of our challenges was, as you have said, never quite planning for the roofs, the carpets, the what have you. However, there was an issue in the early 80s where the school board at the time was not replacing roofs and ran out of money, went to the Board of Supervisors, demanded operating money to fix roofs, and the Board of Supervisors said, never again. You've got to plan better. So at least we're doing that. A quick question on the boundaries, and I know we'll be talking about it in a moment. Clearly complicated boundary decisions, particularly when we open a new high school, and that will be very complicated. We're going to need help with that. But I guess my question is, there are some others that are fairly easy, looking at us in the face, that as long as we follow the criteria that we're going to talk about later on tonight, opportunity for some economic balance where appropriate, and space where it is there, geographic locality, that we're not going to put off everything until we have a huge study. I am assuming that you all are seeing some opportunities in the county, sort of the low-hanging fruit.
I think you'll see some when you look at the maps tonight. You'll see purple beside light blue.
Yes, I
bright
have
red
one.
and light blue. And it's the question is, which problems does it solve if we start expanding a boundary to another section? And I think staff has a really good hold on that, and I think they probably could tell you where some of those are.
Right.
Given the opportunity to look at just the facts of the matter as opposed to the politics of the matter.
Right, exactly. And that's why it's important that we talk again about what are our priorities, what are the things we need to follow, to be fair, and to achieve our instructional objectives as well as efficient use of our buildings. So, okay, any other board members wishing to speak? Guess not. Okay, well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
This was really very instructive to have a mid-year report so we can touch base and see where you're going. And thank you very much for your work and for allocating more time for yourselves.
Okay, so we'll take a 5-minute break and restart at 7 o'clock.